Welcome to this deep dive, everybody. We've got a fascinating, albeit a little unnerving, collection of reports and analyses on CBRN threats. It's like someone hit shuffle on a global threat assessment and threw in a few news headlines for good measure.
It's a real mixed bag, and what strikes me is how fast things are changing. The sources you've gathered really highlight this kind of interconnectedness, the geopolitical tensions, the potential for accidents, even the role of misinformation. It's a lot to untangle.
Definitely a lot to untangle. Well, let's start with the big picture, the current global threat landscape. These reports, one from the UK and one from the US, both emphasize the very real and growing danger of CBRN threats, and it goes way beyond what we're seeing in Ukraine.
Absolutely. The U.S. Biodefense Posture Review uses this phrase, turbulent change, which I think speaks volumes. It's like they're acknowledging that we're in uncharted territory.
Almost like trying to predict the weather, but on a global, much more dangerous scale.
Exactly. And speaking of unpredictable, you included some real-world incidents that really caught my eye. Let's talk about that anthrax escape at the hospital.
Yeah, that one sounded like something straight out of a movie. Who knew hospitals could be on the front lines of CBRN threats?
Right. It's a reminder that even in seemingly controlled environments, those biosecurity protocols, even the basic ones, are absolutely crucial. In this case, it seems a shepherd brought their unvaccinated flock onto the hospital grounds.
Wait, livestock at the hospital? What could possibly go wrong?
Well, 5 people ended up hospitalized with anthrax, so
Oh, wow, okay.
not good. Not good at all. It really underscores the importance of those biosafety measures, especially in areas where resources might be stretched thin. And then, on a completely different note, you have this illegal lab busted in California. Talk about a curveball. Hazardous materials, biological agents, almost 1,000 mice. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, it took them a while to even figure out what they were doing in there. Something about illegal COVID tests and like experimenting on those poor mice.
That's the thing. This wasn't some government operation. This was a privately funded company operating in a regulatory gray zone. Who knows how many more are out there, right?
It's a chilling thought. Honestly, like a hidden world with its own rules, and those rules might not be enough to keep the rest of us safe.
And then, of course, we have to talk about Zaporizhia. I mean, those images of explosives on the roof of a nuclear power plant, talk about a chilling sight.
Chilling is an understatement. Honestly, most of what I know about nuclear meltdowns comes from movies, which I know isn't exactly the most accurate source of information.
You're not alone there. Pop culture has a way of sensationalizing these things. And the reality, especially with modern reactors like the ones at Zaporizhia, is far more complex.
Okay, so no instant fiery apocalypse like we see in the movies. What does a meltdown in a modern reactor actually look like?
Well, these reactors use a completely different design than, say, Chernobyl. There's no graphite to ignite a runaway chain reaction, so a meltdown wouldn't be that big, explosive, fiery event we often imagine. It wouldn't play out like that.
Okay, so not an instant catastrophe, but what about radiation leaks? I mean, that's the real danger, right?
Right, that's the primary concern. Even if there were a meltdown, those containment structures are designed to prevent a massive release. The real threat is when you have a meltdown and a breach of that containment.
So how likely is that scenario? Are we talking about a deliberate attack or maybe something like sabotage, which might be more likely?
That's where it gets really interesting. Dr. Edwin Lyman, the nuclear expert whose analysis you included, argues that the explosives on the roof were never actually intended to cause a large-scale breach.
So more of a power play then, like psychological warfare.
Exactly. A way for Russia to exert control and instill fear. But sabotage is still a very real possibility, right? Dr. Lyman points out that someone could manipulate the reactor's internal systems in a way that could trigger a meltdown. It would be slower and less obvious than an explosion, but with the potential for equally devastating consequences.
It's like a ticking time bomb, but with a trigger that could be pulled from the inside. And what about the water supply for cooling? Didn't the destruction of that Kakhovka Dam earlier this year impact that?
Right, that was a huge concern. The dam's destruction definitely made cooling those reactors more challenging, for sure, but not impossible. They've been trucking in water to keep the cooling ponds operational.
So it's a delicate balance. Any disruption to that supply chain, and things could go south very quickly.
Exactly, and that's the thing. They're operating on a nice edge over there. Let's say, hypothetically, the worst does happen, and there is radioactive release. What are we looking at long term? What happens then?
Yeah, because radiation doesn't exactly respect borders, does it?
Unfortunately not. Wind patterns could carry radioactive material across Europe and beyond, potentially contaminating a vast area. We saw that with Chernobyl and Fukushima. Evacuations, uninhabitable zones, long-term health effects. it's a cascade of consequences and not just a local problem.
Okay, that's a bleak picture, to say the least. So, what's being done to mitigate this risk? Is anyone monitoring the situation at Zaporizhia actively?
Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has inspectors on site who are working to ensure safety protocols are being followed. They've also been pushing for a demilitarized zone around the plant, which, as you can imagine, has been tricky to implement given the ongoing war.
Right, of course, it's not exactly a simple ask under the circumstances. And what about emergency response in the event of an actual incident? You mentioned CBRNe teams earlier. Are they equipped to handle something like this?
Yes, so those SCBA teams, both within Ukraine and internationally, are trained to handle radiological events. They're the elite responders trained to identify those chemical, biological, and radiological agents.
So they're the ones who would be sent in to assess the situation if, God forbid, something were to happen.
Precisely. But here's the thing. They're primarily trained for those smaller scale incidents. Terrorist attacks, industrial accidents, those sorts of events. A full-blown nuclear meltdown on the scale of what could happen at Zaporizhia, that's a whole other beast.
So even those elite teams, those experts, might not be fully equipped to handle a nuclear disaster of that magnitude.
It really makes you think. It's not just about having the right equipment and expertise, it's the sheer logistics of it all. Coordinating evacuations, securing a massive contaminated area, providing medical care, all while a war is raging around you.
Oh, wow. Yeah, a whole other layer of complexity on top of an already devastating situation.
It makes you wonder if we're truly prepared for something of this scale or if we're just relying on outdated playbooks and hoping for the best.
It's definitely a question worth asking. Zaporizhia is a stark reminder that things can escalate incredibly quickly in our world. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about a potential ground zero for a CBRN event, but what about the bigger picture? What's being done on a global scale to address these threats? Okay, so we've covered rogue labs, potential nuclear disasters, and even touched on this idea of a new Cold War. It's a lot to digest. You mentioned something earlier about a global biolabs initiative. What's that all about?
Right, so Global Biolabs is this fascinating project that's basically trying to map out high containment biolabs worldwide. You might be surprised by just how many there are.
More than you'd expect?
Oh, definitely. The whole initiative came about because of all the misinformation surrounding COVID-19, particularly those theories about the virus originating in a lab, remember?
Yeah, how could I forget? It felt like everyone had a theory back then.
Yeah, exactly. So Global Biolabs wants to bring some much-needed transparency to this often very murky world. They want to provide clear, factual information about these labs, where they are, what kind of research they're doing, and most importantly, what safety measures are in place. They even have this interactive map.
Wait, like a Google Maps for biolabs?
Pretty much. It shows you the locations of all these high containment labs, BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs, the ones handling the really dangerous stuff, and even these BSL-3 plus labs, which are kind of a gray area.
BSL-3 plus, what does that even mean?
So these labs are taking extra precautions beyond the typical BSL-3 level, but haven't quite reached the super stringent requirements of a BSL-4 facility. Problem is, there's no universally recognized definition for this BSL-3 plus level.
So they're doing more, but no one's really sure if it's enough.
That's the crux of it. And that's something Global Biolabs is trying to highlight, the need for more research to determine exactly what level of biosafety is necessary for labs working with, say, genetically engineered pathogens or these highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses, the nasty bugs.
The ones that keep epidemiologists up at night.
Exactly. So, yeah, they're doing really important work trying to bring some order to this whole biolab landscape.
It's reassuring to know someone's on it. And speaking of important work, we have to circle back to those SITR teams we talked about earlier, the ones on the front lines of CBRN incidents. You mentioned something about them adapting to new types of warfare. What did you mean by that?
Right. So for a long time, the focus was on this kind of asymmetric warfare, think terrorist attacks using chemical weapons or those smaller scale incidents. But now, with state-sponsored CBRN programs becoming more sophisticated and the potential for large-scale attacks increasing, CBCR teams have to be prepared for pretty much anything.
So we're talking about a huge range of scenarios here, from a lone wolf with a homemade bomb to a full-blown state-sponsored attack.
Exactly. They need to be able to identify all sorts of agents, everything from the rarest toxins to synthetic opioids like fentanyl, understand how those agents might be used, and know how to operate effectively in incredibly high-pressure situations.
It's a high-pressure job, to say the least. What kind of training do these UPCCRA teams go through?
It's intense. They do all these large-scale exercises like Toxic Trip and Toxic Valley, these incredibly realistic simulations of CBRN incidents.
Wow, like a boot camp for CBRN responder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're not just focused on the science either. They also incorporate a lot of forensic training, learning how to properly collect evidence, maintain that chain of custody, all that detective work that's crucial for building a case and holding those responsible accountable for their actions.
So these SBR teams, they're not just scientists, they're investigators too.
Fascinating. Speaking of investigations, we can't forget about those Russia watchers you mentioned, this new generation of experts analyzing Russia's CBRN activities. What sets them apart?
It's almost like we're back in a Cold War spy thriller, you know? This new generation, they're less focused on ideology and more on this deep data analysis. They're digging through open source intelligence, technical documents, anything they can get their hands on to understand Russia's CBRN capabilities. Like academic detectives piecing together clues from these scattered bits of information.
Precisely. And it's not easy because Russia is incredibly secretive about its CBRN programs. Remember those reports a while back about acoustic weapons and wave weapons?
Vaguely, those sounded pretty out there. Were they even real?
Hard to say for sure. Russia has this history of playing up these unconventional weapons systems, even if they're not actually fully operational, a bit of disinformation to keep everyone on edge.
Classic Cold War tactics, sow fear and uncertainty.
Exactly. But even if those specific weapons were more hype than reality, it's still concerning that they're even exploring those avenues, right? It suggests they're not afraid to push the boundaries of what's considered acceptable in warfare.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder how a country like Taiwan, given its unique situation, is approaching CBRN threats. They've got to be on high alert all the time.
Absolutely. Taiwan is fascinating because despite being a relatively small island nation, they've developed a remarkably comprehensive CBRN preparedness program.
What makes their approach so unique?
It's a matter of necessity, really. They're densely populated, heavily industrialized, and face a constant threat from China. So CBRN preparedness is a top priority.
I can only imagine that creates a certain sense of urgency.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
But they've channeled that urgency into this very proactive, multifaceted approach. Dedicated emergency response teams, comprehensive training programs. They even have a special facility where they simulate chemical incidents.
Wow, so they're not just waiting for something to happen, they're actively preparing for every eventuality.
Exactly. They understand that prevention is key. And they're investing heavily in training, infrastructure, public awareness, the whole 9 yards. And it seems to be working. They've actually reported a decrease in CBRN incidents since implementing these programs.
Now that's impressive. It sounds like they're really making an effort to engage with the public on this issue.
Absolutely. They've recognized that CBRN preparedness isn't just the government's responsibility, it's a shared responsibility. So they're working with industries, educating the public, empowering communities to be prepared. It's really quite remarkable.
A model for other nations to follow, for sure. It's a good reminder that even in the face of these complex and often frightening threats, there's always hope, and there are proactive steps we can take to protect ourselves and our communities.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. If there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive, it's that CBRN preparedness isn't just for governments and specialists, it's for all of us.
So what can our listeners do to feel more empowered in this world of CBRN threats? What's a good first step?
Stay curious. Keep asking questions. Seek out reliable information. Think critically about the world around you. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to these complex, ever-evolving issues.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the very real threat of nuclear meltdowns to the hope offered by proactive approaches like Taiwan's. And as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of CBRN threats, one question remains. What does the future hold? As technology advances, what new threats might emerge? And how can we, as a global community, prepare for the unthinkable? Food for thought as you continue your own exploration of this ever-evolving landscape.